Hello and welcome back. In today's project I'll be making a router or fluting jig that can be used on the wood lathe. So this jig will allow you to cut flutes in spindle work and also in the sides of bowls and on the face of bowls as well. So cutting flutes is certainly something you can't do on the lathe with a bowl gouge or something like that. So you need a jig to cut the flutes. Now this is quite a simple design, and I got the idea from the fluting or router jig that Paul Howard sells. And it consists of only three main parts. So there's this part here which is the jig upright or the tower, and I'll be using a piece of this 100 by 50 millimeter steel tubing for that. The second part is the router clamping block. So your router fits in this hole in the middle and you lock up the screw on the side here to lock it in place, and then this block will actually be held into the tower part with a couple of screws that go through these slots here. And lastly, the tower is bolted to a base. So this is the base here. There's a whole bunch of holes so that you can change the position, and these holes will be tapped out so that the base can be bolted from above to make it nice and easy. Now, as I mentioned, the tower will be made out of this steel. That's relatively easy. Probably just cut out the centerpiece and mill it nice and straight, mill out the slots and cut it on an angle here and tidy up, and that should be all done. This block I'll make out of aluminium, and I don't have anything that big, so I've made up this piece here, which will be welded to a bit of plate, and I'll melt down some aluminium and pour it into there so that I've got a piece big enough that will do the job for that block. And the plate is going to be made out of 10 millimeter thick mild steel, and it also has another plate bolted to it which is made out of plastic or something that is able to slide on the lathe bed quite easily, so I still need to work out what I'm going to use for that. So I think I'll start with the tower or the upright part first, and then over the weekend I'll do the casting on the block. I start by cutting off a piece of that 100 by 50 millimeter steel tubing. I clean it all up with the wire wheel on an angle grinder. Now I start doing the layout on where I want to cut pieces out, etc. The layout is done, and before we cut that centerpiece out, I need to make up some plates for the bottom and for the top. For the top I'm going to use this narrower piece, and for the bottom I'll use a piece of 100 by 50 millimeter steel plate. These top and bottom steel plates also provide support for when I cut the center out. Once the center's cut out, I need to cut two 6mm wide slots on each side, and those are for bolting the router to this jig. This is the piece of steel I have for the end plate, and it's a perfect size for the tubing. I just need to cut it off to length. And at the same time I cut that narrower piece off as well. Now the bottom plate needs to be able to be mounted to the base plate, so I'm drilling two 6mm holes here for that. Once that's done, I tack the bottom plate in place, and then I come back and finish weld it. Here I've clamped up the top plate, and I tack and fully weld that as well. Just to tidy up, I grind all those welds down so they're flush. The next step is to cut out that centerpiece, and I'm cutting a hole using a hole saw at each end of that centerpiece. Then I clamp that to the workbench and I just use the angle grinder to cut up on both sides until that centerpiece is cut out. To tidy it all up, I mount it in the mill and use the end mill to clean up the sides. Lastly, I take off the sharp corners with a file. The next step is to mill out the slots for mounting the router to the jig. These are 6mm slots or M6 bolts. Now the last part is to cut most of the back of the upright off, and that will also reduce the weight by quite a lot. Now watch the tension in the steel here when I get to the end and it pops open. There's quite a lot of tension built up in there. So now I'll just clean up the cut edges here. I've completed the jig upright or tower part. The router will go through here. Of course it'll be mounted in a block which screws on through these slots here so it can be lifted up and down. I did intend to do the block today, but the weather is really rubbish today, so it's not very good for aluminium casting. So I'm going to go and start on the base plate here instead. And that base plate is pretty simple, just a rectangle piece of plate with some holes that are drilled in the same place as the holes under here. So that should be relatively easy to make. This is 10mm thick plate steel, and I'm cutting a rectangle piece out for the base. The edge I cut is pretty good, so I'm just giving it a couple of licks on the grinder here, and that's how I can place it down into the vise and then mill the other side. Then I start kind of a tedious job of drilling and tapping out these 18 holes. I'm halfway through here and you can see I've written dimensions on the steel, and that's to match with my DRO so that I know I'm in the right place. Now this fits on absolutely perfectly. I'm very happy with this result. The router will go in the back here, and of course there will be a block in between it. And while it is still raining, I decide to work on the table that mounts to the lathe so that the jig can slide along nice and smoothly on it. So I'm just getting the center here, and then I draw a couple of lines, one each side. And I'm going to use that piece of steel there. And that is 50mm by 7mm, and it fits perfectly in the gap in the lathe bed. I'm marking out 4 places to drill here. 2 of them are to mount the wood onto the steel, and the other 2 are to mount the clamps that keep the whole table on the lathe. I'm using some homemade can't twist clamps to hold the steel onto the wood as I drill through for these mounting holes. Both those holes are tapped out to M8. And here I've got the bolts in there and I'm tightening those down, and that holds that plate on nice and securely. I do a quick test fit on the lathe and there is hardly any movement there, but it slides very nicely. Now when I was testing it, I found that this bolt that's going to go through here for the clamp is going to interfere with the ribs of the lathe underneath in the bed, so I need to move it down a little bit. This is 40mm by 10mm flat bar, and I make 2 of these clamps that hold this table to the lathe. You can see I've rounded the edges off a bit. That's so that it can spin around once I've put the table on. and then we can lock it down. Again, this is a M8 hole being drilled and tapped. Those clamps are fitted to the underside of the table, and I line them up parallel, and then it all fits in. I can push those bolts down and then twist the clamp underneath, and I don't need to hold any spanners or nuts underneath. It all tightens up quite nicely, and then the jig will just slide along nicely on this table. I finally got a half decent day to start doing the casting. Fire up the foundry. We put in the aluminium. While that's melting, I start making the mold for the piece of aluminium that we want to cast. This is a 100 by 100 or 4-inch square piece of tubing. I preheat the tubing on the foundry, and then we can pour the aluminium into the mold. Yesterday I got a whole bunch of casting done. The main focus was to make this type of piece here, so this is going to go into the frame here, and as you can see it's a little bit bigger, which is good because I can mill it down and square up all the sides, and then that should fit in there quite good. Now, since I had the foundry running and I had other bits of aluminium to melt as well, I decided to make up some more round stock. So we've got some small ones down here and some larger ones here. This is the new mold I made. That's 42.5 millimeters, and by the time I turn it down and clean it up, it's going to be well over 1.5 inches in diameter, which will be useful for some of my projects. Now, I also made these blocks at the back. That's in case I have some kind of cavities or something in the one that I want to use here. I just made some extra ones so that I have other material to use instead of having to fire up the foundry again and do more casting. So let's get into milling this piece up to fit into our jig and be able to hold the router. Now, the block was quite wide, so I actually had to cut a 20mm piece off. The size I need is 16mm, but I left a little bit more so it can be milled down and tidied up. This was a very good casting. I can't see any pitting or holes in here at all, so I'm very happy with that. I start by cleaning up the top. And then one of the sides. And I've cleaned up this end, and now I'm cleaning up the bottom, and I do the other sides off camera. I've milled all sides of the block and squared it up, and I've done a bit of a layout on here as well. So I think I can get most of this done in the one setup where it is now. I'm going to mill a little bit off this side and this side so that this block pokes through the tower part of the jig, and it can slide in the slot that we milled earlier in the other part. So those bits will just go down something like 2 or 3 millimeters. I need to put a 44mm hole here for the router to go through. There's a 10mm hole here for the bit that comes out in front of the router bit that has the guide on it. And there are a couple of M6 holes that will be tapped in here, and that is so that this block can be mounted to the tower part of the jig. The router going through here will be clamped by cutting a slot in here, so I'll do that with the angle grinder and the vise, and I'll also need to put it back in the mill here and drill a hole and tap it through here so that we can put a clamping screw in there. And similar at the top, there'll be a slot cut in here and a screw going from the top end down to clamp our 10mm bar up in here. And once all that is done, then it's pretty much complete. I just need to make up the 10mm bar that comes out here and the bit that goes in front of the tool that comes out of the router that is used for the guide. Start by drilling and tapping out these mounting holes. Then I come in and mill down about 2.5mm on each side, and that allows that centerpiece to poke through the tower part of the jig. Next step is to drill this out to 9.5mm, and then I come back and use a 10mm reamer. So I want a nice fit on this hole. And lastly is the big hole, and I start by using drill bits all the way out, and then I use the boring bar to finish the hole off. I stood the part up in the vise and I'm drilling and tapping for the clamp that holds the router. For the clamp to work, I have to cut a slit in here, and then when the bolt is tightened up, those two parts will be pulled together and that holds the router. Once the bolt has been tightened up, that router is locked in there pretty solid. I was going to do the same with the top hole and put a slit in here as well, but I think that might have weakened it, particularly with the slot down the bottom. So instead I'm going to drill a hole and put a thread in there so I can put a locking screw. This is for a M6 bolt. I do a test fit onto the tower part, and that is good. The plate here turned out great, so I can easily adjust the height by unscrewing these screws and then adjust it up and down and tightening these back up. Now I have done a little test in the lathe just on this piece here, and it works absolutely fine. But I had no depth control on this sample, so that's the next step to work on. This is the proposal for the guide and depth mechanism that we're going to put in the front. So I'll have a bit of 10mm round bar that fits into here nicely. I'm just using a reamer because that's machined and I want to have the bar about the same size as that. And although it bumps into the router at the back here, I still have about 10mm of movement I can come in and out, and then, you know, lock it down. So I'll be able to set the depth, you know, to 10mm or so, which is going to be plenty. Then I'm going to have a piece of this 16mm by 16mm square bar. I'm going to drill a hole and ream it through here so it fits onto the round bar here. And there will be a locking screw that goes in the top here to lock it in position. So again, this could probably come in and out depending if we need more depth. So there's options there given the restriction we have at the back. Then we'll have the ring that goes round the nut here. Now this doesn't have a big enough hole, but it'll go, well, the tool just sort of pokes out there now, so it'll be sort of in that position, and then we'll be able to move it back to get a deeper cut out the front here. The first thing I do is bore out that center hole and also face off the front. I've clamped it up in the right place, and that is tacked, and then I fully weld it. The next step is to drill a 9.5mm hole, and then that hole is reamed out to 10mm, and that fits onto the bar. That is cut off to the right length and I tidy it up off camera. Now I need to drill and tap a M6 hole in the top. I do that off camera, but I just show you how I square up the part using a little square in the vise so that we're straight up and down. And I do have a piece at the other end of the vise here to keep those jaws parallel as well. The last part is that 10mm bar, and I'm turning down a piece of 12mm mild steel. Give that a polish up with some sandpaper. Then that is cut off to the right length. Lastly, I assemble it onto the router, and that part's pretty much done. This is a guide bushing that I turned up on the wood lathe. It fits over the router bit and locks into position underneath there. This guide bushing stops the router bit from digging in too far. This is a piece of 10mm plastic that I'm using underneath the base, and that will allow the jig to be able to slide nicely on the table that I made earlier. It's held on by 4 countersunk screws, and I drill a few different holes so I can change the position of those screws if I need to. That's bolted onto the bottom plate. Now I clean all the metal parts down in acetone to get any grime and grease off of them. Most of the parts are blued in this permablue or cold bluing solution. After that, the parts are oiled up to give them a protective coating. The tower or upright piece is going to be painted. This is an undercoat. Can you guess what colour this is going to be? Burgundy, my second favourite. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Sorry, wrong record. Alright, now it's time to test out the jig. This is a piece of pine. It's not really used for turning, it's just a really cheap building wood. But I had this bit left over, so I'm just sort of marking out what I want to do here. And then I start cutting the flutes. You can see I'm taking several swipes at this. So I'm not pushing the cutter right in until the last cut. We rotate it round and we just keep going round and round until all 8 flutes are done. Once that's complete, I then start shaping the item that I want to make here. Now this is what we call a weed pot. No, not that weed. It's actually for dried flowers. I'm cleaning up the top end here. This has a hole drilled in the centre to put your dried flowers into. I sand up the end here through all the grits, and then I start adding the finish. The last part here is to part the item off, and I get to a certain point, then I use a saw to cut the remainder. I have finished the router fluting jig up to this point here, and as you saw, I did some fluting on this test piece here, and to be honest, these flutes came out pretty good for the first attempt. This piece of wood is not a very good piece of wood for doing turning with. It's just a bit of pine, basically a bit of scrap wood, and you can see here there's a bit of tear out, but overall, I mean, I think the flutes turned out pretty good. I probably spent a bit too much time trying to finish this off, but it is the first piece and I thought it turned out not too bad, to be honest. You saw in the video there's a lot of tear out at the back here on the bottom, and I just sort of sanded that as best as I could. But anyway, there'll be probably plenty more better pieces coming in the future, hopefully. Now the jig did perform pretty well. I've got the bit sticking out probably about 8 to 10 millimeters, so I had to run the flutes in a couple of passes. Now the center height here has been set. I actually put a mark here. Now this suits my lathe, so it probably would never be moved from this position, but if I went to someone else's house or down to the club and used a different lathe, then I'll be able to change this height here. Now when I mentioned that it is finished to this stage, I mean it's certainly usable, but I do want to do some upgrades with it as well. So there is a tilting table that this tower piece bolts onto. So you unbolt this plate at the bottom and you bolt the tower onto the tilting table, and it basically allows the jig to be tilted or pivoted on a central bar down the bottom like this, and that's for cutting flutes in the face of bowls and platters and things like that. So that's one other thing that I want to make for this fluting jig. Now this wooden insert that I turned up to put in here as the guide, so it sort of pushes at the top and the bottom of the flute here so that you can actually follow a curve. Now in this example here, I cut straight flutes and then I came back later and shaped this part here, and that's what gives it these flutes that sort of disappear off to the right and off to the left here. But if you've already turned your item with a curve on it, then this part here will rub on it and you can actually cut along that profile of the curve. Now this is made for this 1/2 inch bit, so it has quite a big hole in it, but for smaller bits or other types of bits, then you would make these pieces to suit that. So all in all, I'm very happy with the jig. It's very solid. It slides along on that baseboard very nicely, and I didn't feel any hints of it wanting to tip over. So it's good that there's quite a bit of weight in that bottom plate to give it that stability. So apart from the tilting attachment, this project's done, and I need to move on to finishing off my bandsaw because I'm really holding out for that. So that will be the next video. I hope everyone has a great day, and once again, thanks for watching.